I'm going to read out aloud today this particular article, blog post, from May 8th, 2006. As you can see, likely as not, we're talking about the fall. So what more appropriate thing for this particular channel to do than to read out aloud for you all? Part one of this three-part series which Mark Fisher K-Punk wrote about one of his favourite recording artists of all time, The Fall. Memorex for the Krakens. The Fall's Pulp Modernism. Part 1. Dragnet sleeve notes. Maybe industrial ghosts are making spectres redundant. Spectre vs. Rector. M.R. James be born. Yog Sogvoth rape me lord. Sludge High Choi. Van Greenway. R. Corman. Mark Sinker. Scrawny, gnarled, gaunt. Smith doesn't waltz with ghosts, he materializes them. Who can put their finger on the weird? It's taken me more than 20 years to attempt this deciphering. Back then, the fall did something to me. But what? And how? Let's call it an event, and at the same time note that all events have a dimension of the uncanny. If something is too alien, it will fail to register. If it is too easily recognized, too easily cognizable, it will never be more than a reiteration of the already known. When the fall pummeled their way into my nervous system circa 1983, it was as if a world that was familiar and which I had thought too familiar, too quotidian to feature in rock, had returned, expressionistically transfigured, permanently altered. I didn't know then that already in 1983 the Fall's greatest work was behind them. No doubt the later albums have their merits, but it is on Grotesque 1980, Slate's 1981, and Hex Induction Hour 1982 where group the reached a pitch of sustained abstract invention that they and few others are unlikely to surpass. In its ambition, its linguistic inventiveness, and its formal innovation, this triptych bears comparison with the great works of 20th century higher literary modernism, Joyce, Eliot, Lewis. The Fall extend and performatively critique that mode of high modernism by reversing the impersonation of working-class accent, dialect, and diction that, for example, Eliot performed in The Wasteland. Smith's strategy involved aggressively retaining accent while using, in the domain of a supposedly popular entertainment form, highly arcane literary practices. In doing so, he laid waste the notion that intelligence, literary sophistication, and artistic experimentalism are the exclusive preserve of the privileged and the formally educated. But Smith knew that aping masterclass mores presented all sorts of other dangers. It should never be a matter of proving to the masters that the white crap could be civilized. Perhaps all his writing was, from the start, an attempt to find a way out of that paradox which all working-class aspirants face, the impossibility of working-class achievement. Stay where you are, speak the language of your fathers, and you remain nothing. Move up, learn to speak in the master language, and you have become a something, but only by erasing your origins. Isn't the achievement precisely that erasure? You can string a sentence together. How can you possibly be working class, my dear? The temptation for Smith was always to fit into the easy role of working-class spokesman, speaking from an assigned place in a given social world. Smith played with that role, the white crap that talks back, prole art threat, hip priest, whilst refusing to actually play it. He knew that representation was a trap. Social realism was the enemy because, in supposedly merely representing the social order, it actually constituted it. Against the social realism of the official left, Smith developed a late 20th century urban English version of the grotesque realism Bakhtin famously described in Rabelais and His World. Crucial to this grotesque realism is a contestation of the classificatory system which deems cultures, and populations, to be either refined or vulgar. As Peter Stalybras and Alan White argued, the grotesque tends to operate as a critique of a dominant ideology which has already set the terms of, designating what is high and low. Instead of the high modernist appropriation of working-class speech and culture, Smith's pulp modernism reacquaints modernism with its disavowed pulp doppelganger. Lovecraft is the crucial figure here, since his texts, which first appeared in pulp magazines like Weird Tales, emerged from an occulted trade between pulp horror and modernism. Follow the line back from Lovecraft's short stories, and you pass through Dunsany and M.R. James before coming to Poe. But Poe also played a decisive role in the development of modernism via his influence on Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Valery, and their admirer T.S. Eliot. The Wasteland's debt to Dracula, for instance, is well known. The fragmentary citational structure of a story like Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu, meanwhile, recalls The Wasteland. More than that, as Benjamin Noyes argued in his paper Lovecraft, the Synfoam, given at the recent Gothic Remains conference at Sussex, the abominations from which Lovecraft's straight-laced scholars recoil bear comparisons with Cubist and Futurist art. Lovecraft, that is to say, turns modernism into an object of horror. Yet Lovecraft's texts are exemplary of weird, rather than straightforwardly Gothic, fiction. Weird fiction has its own consistency, which can be most clearly delineated by comparing it to two adjacent modes, fantasy and the uncanny. Fantasy, and Tolkien is the exemplar here, presupposes a completed world, a world that, although superficially different to ours, there may be different species or supernatural forces, is politically all too familiar. There is usually some nostalgia for the ordered organization of feudal hierarchy. The uncanny, meanwhile, is set in our world, only that world is no longer ours anymore. It no longer coincides with itself. It has been estranged. The weird, however, depends upon the difference between two or more worlds, with world here having an ontological sense. It is not a question of an empirical difference. The aliens are not from another planet, they are invaders from another reality system. Hence, the defining image is that of the threshold, the door from this world into another, and the key figure is the lurker at the threshold, what in Lovecraft's mythos is called Yog-Sothoth. The political philosophical implications are clear. There is no world. What we call the world is a local consensus hallucination, a shared dream. Is there anybody there? Part 1 of Spectre vs. Rector. The Rector lived in Hampshire. The Spectre was from Corazina. Spectre vs. Rector, from 1979's Dragnet, is the first moment, still chilling to hear, when the Fall both lay out and implement their pulp modernist methodology. Spectre vs. Rector is not only a ghost story, it is a commentary on the ghost story. The chorus, if it can be called that, is a litany of pulp forebears. M.R. James, be born, Yog-Sothoth, rape me, Lord, in which language devolves into a signifying chant, verbal ectoplasm. Sludge High, Choi, Van Greenway, R. Corman. Not coincidentally, Spectre vs. Rector was the moment when the Fall really began to sound like themselves. Before that, the Fall sound is a grey-complexioned, conspicuously consumptive, garage plink-plonk punk, amphetamine lean and on edge, marijuana fatalistic, simultaneously arrogant and unsure of itself, proffering its cheap and nastiness as a challenge. All of the elements of Smith's later Peripheral Vision are there on Live at the Witch Trials and on the other tracks on Dragnet. Watery-eyed figures lurking in the corner of the retina, industrial estates glimpsed through psychotropic stupor. But they have not yet been condensed down, pulped into the witch's brew that will constitute Smith's plane of consistency. On Spectre vs. Rector, any vestigial rock presence subsides into hauntology. The original track is nothing of the sort. It is already a palimpsest, spooked by itself. At least two versions are playing, out of sync. The track, and it is very definitely a track, not a song, foregrounds both its own textuality and its texturality. It begins with cassette hum, and when the sleeve notes tell us that it was partly recorded in a damp warehouse in MC/R, we are far from surprised. Steve Hanley's bass rumbles and thumps like some implacable earth-moving machine invented by a deranged underground race, not so much rising from subterranea as dragging the sound down into a troglodytic goblin kingdom in which ordinary sonic values are inverted. From now on, and for all the records that really matter, Hanley's bass will be the lead instrument, the monstrous foundations on which the Fall's upside-down sound will be built. Like Joy Division, fellow modernists from Manchester, the Fall scrambled the grammar of white rock by privileging rhythm over melody. Fellow modernists they might have been, but the Fall and Joy Division's take on modernism could not have been more different. Hannett and Saville gave Joy Division a minimalist, metallic austerity. The Fall sound and cover art, by contrast, was gnarled collage cut up, deliberately incomplete. Both bands were dominated by forbiddingly intense vocalist visionaries. But where Curtis was the depressive neurotic, the end of the European romantic line, Smith was the psychotic, the self-styled destroyer of romanticism. Unsuitable for romantics, Smith will graffiti onto the cover of Hex Induction Hour, and Spectre vs. Rector is the template for the anti-romantic methodology he will deploy on the Fall's most important releases. After Spectre vs. Rector, there is no Marquis Smith the romantic subject. The novelty of Smith's approach is to impose the novel or tale form, part 1 of Spectre vs. Rector, into the romantic lyrical tradition of the R&R song, so that the author function supplants that of the lyrical balladeer. There are parallels between what Smith does to rock and the cut-up surgery Eliot performed on the etherized patient of romantic expressive subjectivity in his early poems. Smith chant-narrates, not sings, Spectre versus Rector. The story is simple enough, and on the surface is deliberately conventional, a post-Exorcist revisiting of the classic English ghost story. At another level, the narrative is generated by a Roussel-like playing with similar words, rector/spectre/inspector/exorcist/exhausted. A rector is possessed by a malign spirit. The spectre was from Corazina, described on the sleeve notes as a negative Jerusalem. A police inspector tries to intervene but is driven insane. This is a real Lovecraftian touch, since the dread fate that haunts Lovecraft's characters is not of being consumed by the polytendrilled abominations, but by the schizophrenia that their appearance often engenders. Both Rector and Inspector have to be saved by a third figure, a shaman hero, an outsider who goes back to the mountains when the exorcism is complete. The Rector stands for rectitude and rectilinearity as well as for traditional religious authority. The ontological shock that Lovecraft's monstrosities produce is typically described, any Lovecraft reader will recall, in terms of a twisting of rectilinear geometries. The Inspector, meanwhile, as Ian Penman conjectured in his 1980 interview with The Fall, stands for an investigative empirical worldview. The hero, his soul possessed 1,000 times, has more affinity with the Spectre, whom he absorbs and becomes. The Spectre possesses the hero, but the possession is ineffectual. Then with the agents of rectitude and or empirical investigation. It seems that the hero is driven more by his addiction to being possessed, which is to say dispossessed of his own identity. That was his kick from life, than from any altruistic motive. He has no love for the social order he rescues. I have saved 1,000 souls, they cannot even save their own, but in which he does not occupy a place. Those flowers take them away, he said. They're only funeral decorations, and this is a drudge nation, a nation of no imagination. A stupid dead man is their ideal. They shirk me and think me unclean. Unclean. In Madness and Civilization, Foucault argues that the insane occupy the structural position vacated by the leper, while in The Ecstasy of Communication, Baudrillard describes the state of terror proper to the schizophrenic, too great a proximity of everything, the unclean promiscuity of everything which touches, invests, and penetrates without resistance, with no halo of private projection to protect him any more. Baudrillard is of course describing the schizophrenia of media systems, which overwhelm all interiority. Television brings us voices from far away, and there's always something on the other side. For Baudrillard, there is an increasing flatness between media and the schizophrenic delirium in which they feature. Psychotics often describe themselves as receivers for transmitted signal, and what is the hero of Spectre vs. Rector if not another version of the ESP medium of discord that Smith sings of on Psychic Dance Hall? Smith's own methodology as writer-ranter-chanter echoes that of the hero malcontent. He becomes, nothing but, the mystic pad on which stray psychic signals impress themselves, the throat through which a warring multiplicity of mutually antagonistic voices speak. This is not only a matter of the familiar idea that Smith contains multitudes. The schizophrenic riot of voices is itself subject to all kinds of medication. The voices we hear will often be reported speech, recorded in the compressed telegraphic headline style Smith borrowed from the Lewis of Blast. Listening to The Fall now, I'm often reminded of another admirer of Lewis, Marshall McLuhan. The McLuhan of The Mechanical Bride, subtitled The Folklore of Industrial Man, understood very well the complicity between mass media, modernism, and pulp. McLuhan argued that modernist collage was a response to the perfectly schizophrenic layout of the newspaper front page, and Poe, who in addition to his role as a forebear of weird fiction, was also the inventor of the detective genre, plays a crucial role in The Mechanical Bride. Next, in Part 2, Grotesque Peasants, Psychedelic Communism, Bear on Life, Ragnarok. Thanks again, my friends.